Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. As always, I am joined by a panel of brilliant South Africans scattered around the world. Joining us from Germany, where he runs the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the brainiac of Bremen, Dr. James Myberg. Hopping across the Atlantic, we are joined by the director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, the Secretary of War of the Smithsonian, Richard Tren, and finally, joining us from the Common Sense HQ, the founder of France Cranier Private Clients, the editor of the Common Sense, the madman of Melrose Arch, Dr. France Cranier. So we've got a jam-packed show today, gentlemen. But I think that we want to start on a much more serious note. And Richard, maybe you can just talk to us about the tragic events that happened yesterday on the evening of Yom Kippur.
Yeah, look, in England, in Manchester, 2 Jews murdered by a man of Syrian descent outside their synagogue. This is horrific, and I think we're going to address this quickly now, but this is a topic maybe for a longer discussion at a later date. But let's just acknowledge how bad levels of anti-Semitism have become in Western Europe. And it's not for nothing that this comes right after Sir Keir Starmer acknowledges or recognizes the state of Palestine, whatever that is supposed to be. I think people respond to incentives. In doing so, Starmer has rewarded Hamas and its terrorism, and he's also signals that violence and murder will achieve results. You can get what you want if you murder Jews. This has to be stopped. The West has been pusillanimous in the face of an ideology that seeks to destroy the West. And I think the sooner we address this and stop this immediately, the better. I don't know what else there is to say, but other than that, this is happening across the West, and I fear we'll get more of it unless action is taken immediately.
Yeah, I was told this morning that this wasn't a once-off thing either, and that the only thing that happened here is that the security services missed it, but that there have been several similar conspiracies to launch similar attacks against Jews in the UK that have been intercepted or prevented or sort of shown off. That's even more worrying. That it's not a once-off thing, but it's now a phenomena within the UK. And one in a conversation I had with someone else this morning, one of the things they mentioned about it is that people get immigration wrong. That the immigration's not the problem in Europe; it's assimilation. That immigration with assimilation into Western values is fine. But immigration without assimilation into Western values is simply setting up Western society for a terrible conflict, of which events like these are reminders.
Yes, exactly. And Britain is a prime example of that kind of immigration without any attempt to assimilate. In fact, you get a sort of apology from Britain for its Western values. And I know we've got a busy time, but let me just say one point. Since October 7th, every weekend you've seen massive demonstrations, pro-Hamas demonstrations, baying for Jewish blood. And at the same time we've seen the videos of police in London warning Jews to stay away, threatening them with arrest for looking visibly Jewish because they might upset the people who are demanding the destruction of Israel and the destruction of the Jewish people. This is completely upside down, and this is a wake-up call. I don't know that Starmer has it in him, that worm, to do something about it, but he must. He should.
Yeah, for sure. I think that this is an example of a terrible problem and something that we will spend a proper episode getting to grips with, the whole question of Islamism in Europe of immigration and of, what is the correct response to assimilation into the West. But on that point, one of the key Western values that we pride ourselves on here is freedom of speech. And Richard, you upset quite a few people last week with some of your comments on R.F.K. And I thought that I received an incredibly thoughtful response from a good friend of mine, and I thought I might read it to you just to get some of your thoughts. I think this was the most well measured response that we did have to the RFK topic last week. So he starts with, I partially disagreed with the RFK points Richard made. RFK is an unreliable actor and certainly makes many, many spurious claims. Put that aside. But I think you can lend some credence to his high level view. There is a major structural issue with nutrition in the US, and it is upstream of the majority of chronic disease. Almost half the population is obese, and almost 80% is overweight. That cannot happen if people are eating whole/unprocessed foods. That would take a whole hell of a lot of chicken, fruits, and veggies. Big food, in quotation marks, has become incredibly efficient here over the last century. Food is widely available and cheap, but it's bad food. These food companies design foods to encourage addictive behavior and high consumption. It is maybe extreme to say big food is trying to kill Americans, but it is certainly killing them. The incentive is near term. If people get sick after eating poorly for 20 years, that is not the concern of any food CEO today. It doesn't matter to them. But it does matter because while the food is cheap, we end up paying the cost. You get a population that is growing increasingly unhappy, unhealthy, and unproductive. Healthcare costs here are skyrocketing alongside the prevalence of chronic disease. There is a lack of access and familiarity with high quality unprocessed food in many places across the country, food deserts. I don't think it's reasonable to expect people to correct this issue for themselves. It is a structural issue, an externality. It can only be corrected by intervention. The state has a legitimate role to play in telling you what to eat because population level health ultimately is the state's concern. RFK is right insofar as big food is a problem. I'm not sure what the right interventions are, but some are required. Corn syrup is particularly insidious not as a standalone product, but because it has been added as an ingredient in an enormous swath of products since the 1970s. It is ubiquitous and driving often inadvertent sugar consumption. It should not be in bread. I think that sort of thing should be regulated against, etc. Just some food for thought.
You want me to respond to that?
Yes,
Look, he
please.
makes important points, and I agree with him very largely. And I think I said that part of the problem that we have with this obesity is from government advice that started in the 70s and 80s, telling people to eat less protein and more carbs. So the government started this problem. My worry is that RFK is trying to reestablish credibility in these government agencies, but he's not doing a very good job because he's not particularly a credible actor here. On the corn syrup, yes, I think I made the point that the reason we have so much corn syrup is that the government keeps on subsidizing corn and subsidizing bad behavior. So first of all, let's stop subsidizing agriculture in this way that leads to huge amounts of unnecessary sugar in our food. But I do worry that we get away from something. And sorry, let me just say, when I first moved to the United States and I bought bread from a supermarket, I noticed how sweet it was. South African bread isn't sweet. English bread isn't sweet. You do notice immediately. But you know what I did? I stopped eating that bread and I chose other things to eat. And I worry that we're removing agency from people, from adults who can and should make their own choices. We keep on treating adults like they are children, like they are not able to regulate themselves. And we treat children like they're adults. How often do you see children demanding something and the parents giving in and giving them the Big Mac? So I think the first thing is to demand that adults, or to acknowledge that people have agency. Adults can choose how to eat, and we can certainly educate them about a healthy diet. And I'm all in on RFK's attempts to improve fitness and improve diet. But let's start taking responsibility for our own actions first. That the day that we did that thing, or rather the day before, I went out to the lunch and I had a delicious hamburger and fries. The next day I had a kale salad, because I know that if I eat a hamburger and fries every day, I'll end up looking like some mafuta. And I'll get hissed at on the streets of DC. But so what can I say? Treat people like adults. Start. The more we take responsibility for our own actions, the better. And if R.F.K. can stress that, fine. But he's losing me in this fight by blaming. I think companies are not trying to addict us to anything. They're trying to make things delicious, and we can change those incentives. But deliciousness isn't addictive, or doesn't equal addiction.
Yes, and I think it's a case here of trying to separate out a lot of the kind of wheat from the chaff, that there's lots of positives to what R.F.K. is doing on some things, and then there's the more extreme, more challenging areas of his policy.
Sure. Thank you for the letter. We encourage more. Please send them in. Tear us down.
Exactly. Please, everyone, feel free to make sure that you put us all in our places, because otherwise our heads will grow even larger than they already are.
And as long as they go to Gabriel and not to me, I don't care.
So, but Richard, we're gonna stay with you, and we're gonna start on the first topic of today, and that is you were invited to a very important dinner. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Yeah, I was very lucky and honored to be invited to a dinner at the White House Historical Association, there's a museum of the White House. It's right next door. It's 1 block from the White House. And it was a dinner to honor Gary Player, who was in town. He had been here to visit President Trump and to participate in things building on our previous discussion on improving fitness and diet. And it was amazing. Gary Player is a legend. He's almost 90. And if you met him, you'd think he was maybe 70. He's physically and mentally incredibly fit. And the point of so he was being honored at this dinner because he's played golf with I think 8 or 9 presidents, certainly every president since Gerald Ford, every sitting president. But he gave this talk reminiscing about his playing golf with Eisenhower, and had very interesting remarks to say about that. And then everyone since, Nixon and Ford and Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, all the way through to Trump. He did mention that he didn't play golf with President Biden because he wasn't physically up to it, but that he did mention what a nice letter he got from President Biden. He's an incredibly gracious man, and throughout his talk, you got a sense of he exhibits that finest human quality, which is a sense of gratitude. He's obviously an incredibly talented man. He's a man of great drive and grit, but throughout it, he mentioned how grateful he was for the opportunities afforded to him throughout his life. And he's a man who clearly loves South Africa deeply and loves America too. He has a house here. He spent a lot of time here in Florida. And so he was just a remarkable, wonderful man. And it was a privilege to meet him. I will say the dinner was attended, I guess there were about maybe 40 people, and it was an interesting collection of people. There were some high-level businessmen from South Africa, investors from the United States. There were international investors there. There were some diplomats there. As an aside, and coming back to our first topic, I had a long discussion with the ambassador, and I won't mention which country, but from one of the Gulf kingdoms, who was very interesting, talking about the changing dynamics in the Middle East. And he was fascinating and confirming a lot of what we think, and leaving me quite optimistic about the future there. But anyway, that's aside. We had there were people from senior people from the National Security Council, from the White House, from the State Department, staffers from Congress. And these are all very busy people that have a lot on their agendas, and they chose to come here. And I got the sense of a great deal of goodwill from this group of people there who understand and know Africa and South Africa. I got the profound sense that there is an outstretched hand. Sadly, the South African government officials weren't there, but there is an outstretched hand. And it's serious. These are serious people who want good things. They want a mutually beneficial relationship, and that hand should be shaken. Should be shook. What's the correct term? Should be shaken. Whatever. So that's the end of my social life. That's the most exciting dinner that I had this week.
And Richard, just on that point about the kind of goodwill that you were feeling towards South Africa, do you think do you think the goodwill extends so far as to the Americans desire a comprehensive deal with the South Africans, that it's like they really do want to have a kind of transform, as France has talked about in a previous episode, that on the Americans' behalf, that did you get the sense that they really do want to do this kind of transformative deal that really resets South Africa-American relations and like builds a very deep trade relationship?
Yes, I do, profoundly. There is a desire for this. I think, look, United States, and I noticed this when I first moved here. Americans celebrate success, and they want good things for their friends. They want bad things for their enemies, and if you look around the world, American enemies deserve the bad things coming to them. But for American friends, if you want a good relationship, they will celebrate that, and they will build on that, and they will find a mutually beneficial. Mutually beneficial is the key term here, and I think they want that. They see a huge potential for an advantageous trade and investment relationship. It's there for the taking, and I think these people genuinely want to help, and they care deeply about the region and South Africa in particular.
Thank you,
Gabriel, that's exactly my experience, and I know a bit about this. That there's been a narrative driven in the South African media that the US is hostile to South Africa, and its trade and investment efforts are hostile as well. It seeks to do harm. The informed sense is that that's completely false. The US is extremely interested in striking not just a good trade and tariff terms with South Africa. That's really quite a small thing, but in fact going a lot further to strike a massive investment deal with the country. One of the views from Washington of South Africa is look, as 1% growth economy with a 30% unemployment rate, South Africa is not a great long-term prospect as a sort of Western ally. And that in order to ensure that it does remain a free and open society and a democracy, an enormous amount needs to be done to invest in in raising its investment rate and therefore its rate of economic growth. The Americans are extremely keen to do that. South Africa is now standing as one of very few countries that hasn't been able to conclude even a tariff deal with the United States, let alone the bigger objective of a sort of sweeping investment deal. And the reason for that in the main is the difficultness, foot dragging, and transigence of South African state actors in Washington and in Pretoria. And those efforts, that foot dragging has at times so frustrated people that third-party private actors, some opposition politicians, some civil rights or activist groups, and some business people have had to step into the breach to rescue the situation and to say to the Americans, look, this is something we face at home, this very slow move towards reform, if at all. We're familiar with it. But South Africa, we wish to assure you, wants to do a deal with you. These are viable deals. The prospect is viable. And these groups have done fantastically good work. But the South Africans, often in looking to manufacture a reason why no deal has been done, have sought to cast many of these private efforts as sabotage. And one of the people involved, there have been several independent of each other, business people and the like, actually drafting because the South African government doesn't do it. Not a tariff deal, which is a small thing. Even if we get the tariffs down to 10%, we won't move the dial on the country's growth rate by much at all. But the big deal, drafting it, sending it to American friends and allies, saying, consider this, trying really hard to get the South Africans on board as well. And they're faced with a scurrilous sort of stuff in the media. And one of the chaps involved in that sort of work said to me, it's as absurd to say we're sabotaging the relationship as to suggest that our efforts at home to create jobs, to invest in the country, to lift the rate of growth, are actually a dastardly plan to undermine the economy, sabotage job creation, and sink the rate of economic growth. So I think it's important. I mean, some people have been going very carefully. They don't want to upset the South Africans. I think we're past that now. And I think it needs to be said, the reason South Africa doesn't have a tariff deal with the US yet is because the South Africans have been foot dragging. And the reason we're not thinking the bigger thought about the massive investment deal that could really put South Africa and its GNU on a different track, that deal, if it was done in and of itself, could raise South Africa's investment rate appreciably and the rate of economic growth from where it currently sits at 1%, I'd say comfortably to 2%, and perhaps even approaching 3%. And the reason we're not there is because the South African side doesn't want such a deal with the United States. And the reason they don't want the deal with the US is if you've got a South African domestic sort of perspective or experience, the same reason the South African state hasn't moved fully to concession the country's failing ports and failing railways is that the South African state feels that if they did that, and therefore placed the ports and railways in private hands, the state would lose control of a strategic asset. And the view on the United States is the same thing. If a truly massive investment deal was done that actually appreciably moved the rate of economic growth, the effect would be to give the US and foreign investors access to the economy at an unprecedented level, and therefore access to strategic assets that should be in and under the control of the state. And the tragedy of all of it, for let's say for the ANC, is that as it seeks to cling to what control it has left, it creates the economic circumstances that cause it to lose control in the long run. So it's only at 40%. It's at 40% of the vote. The polls are lower now. But it was at 40% of the vote in the election last year, in part because it kept trying to cling to control. And now to cling to the last control, it doesn't want to do a massive trade and investment deal, because then the private sector and foreign investors would own too much of the country's economy. And so, yeah, exactly what Richard Sense was at his dinner on Tuesday resonates exactly with the experience of a lot of people, the best interests of the country at heart, who are deeply frustrated at the performance of the South African official delegations in Washington, D.C. Gabriel.
Yeah,
Essentially, Gabriel, we need them to listen to Sting's song, "If you love someone, set them free." It's time to set them free.
exactly. Well, it's time that we get serious. Well, it's well past time that the South Africans actually get serious about this deal, because as you two have pointed out, we are literally leaving a deal on the table, and despite several people's best efforts, it seems as though the South African state is determined to leave it there.
Can we say quickly that we haven't fired Simon?
Yes. Where's Simon?
Yes. It's just important to note that Simon, the reason why we don't have the crank of bank, the finance bro of Soho, here with us today is because the Lib Dem Green Alliance launched a bomb at his office and it's now flooding. And so you can thank nefarious Ed Davies for our Simon's absence today.
I thought it might be he was arrested for making a tweet that somebody didn't like, but I'm glad he isn't sitting in prison.
Yeah, so he hasn't been arrested for tweeting. Maybe still, you never know. That seems to be completely mad. But maybe we'll talk about that one day, about the madness of what you get arrested for in the UK these days. Sorry, Gabriel, back to you.
Yes, well, I think we're going to stay on the topic of the United States and South Africa, and we're going to go to you, James, because you're going to tell us about a story that really should have been given quite a bit more attention when it was happening, and that people really do need to understand. And it's the story of an American fix-it man coming to try and fix the DA. So James, can you take us away into this?
Sure. There's the Daily Maverick's been publishing extracts from the memoirs of James Self, who was a long-term DA veteran, served as an MP from 1994, ended up as the Federal Council chairperson. Very tragically died in 2024, I think, and he had written sort of fragments of his memoirs, which the Daily Maverick is now sort of publishing. And there was a very interesting revelation this week concerning the whole brouhaha and attempt to fire Helen Ziller from the DA back in 2017 over the famous or infamous Singapore tweet. What is revealed there is the following. Now, the Bill Clinton's pollster in the 1992 election campaign was a very, very bright and able person called Stan Greenberg. And he obviously played a critical role in the 1992 election, was from, I think, the liberal side of the Democratic Party. And from there, he was invited to serve as the pollster for the ANC in the 1994 campaign. And was, I think, instrumental in coming up with the Better Life for All slogan. And then again in the 99 campaign, so 94, you could say, well, that's the Mandela sort of, when the Mandela image was at its greatest. 99, of course, that's Thabo Mbeki coming in. We've already had the cadre deployment launch, demographic representativity, the arms deal, the denial of antiretrovirals as pre-exposure prophylaxis to pregnant women, which leads to many, many thousands of deaths. And he comes in 99 as well. And that campaign, the ANC is trying to get to a two-thirds majority, and Greenberg advises on that campaign. And then obviously the ANC loses some of its luster. And he's then in 2013 brought in as the DA's pollster by Wilmot James, who's he's not from the DA originally. He comes in very late when everyone's very upset with, the ANC of Zuma. He brings in Stan Greenberg, and Greenberg now does the polling for the DA. And what is revealed in this memoir, or the extract that was published this week, is that the person who was driving the expulsion of a failed expulsion of Helen Ziller from the DA was Greenberg. And that was as an effort at the time to try and create what is called a disruptive moment, that by going after Ziller, Musi Maimane would be shown to be, not a puppet of the whites, and that in this way, the sort of huge disgruntled black vote would be unlocked to the DA, and this would help carry them to power in the 2019 elections. So that whole controversy over Ziller and all the efforts to get rid of her, and then there's a huge court case. That wasn't organic. That wasn't based on particularly on principle. It was based on this the advice of this American pollster that this was the way that you would unlock this huge black vote to the DA. And it was part of a broader strategy which continued. So it's not just Helen who was the victim of that. It also then led to that debacle in Schweizer-Reneke, where a very misleading image was published of some black children sitting separately from some white children in a class. There was a totally innocent explanation of that, but it's one of those, it went totally viral and everyone got totally the wrong end of the stick. And it led to a mob then invading that school, a racial mob invading that school, terrorizing these primary school children, including the child who was supposedly the victim of this alleged racism, which was totally false. And that total debacle, because the DA also, again, said, well, this is a disruptive moment and we'll prove we're against racism and show we're on the side of the black majority and thereby win black votes. That's the DA then, put themselves right in the middle of that absolute debacle. And it led to the loss of 500,000 Afrikaner votes in the 2019 election. That then led to an investigation into what went wrong, and then Helen Zille's return to active politics in the DA. So that's the background. But I suppose it wasn't the DA being mad, which was what we thought at the time. It was part of the strategy being driven from America, and which at the time, I mean, I wrote about this repeatedly at each stage of this process. It never made any sense. It wasn't going to win any black votes. It was going to destroy the DA, and it almost did. It destroyed the DA. And anyway, so that's now been confirmed through this memoir, this whole sort of history of the incident, and which almost led to the destruction of the political opposition in South Africa. So anyway, it's very interesting that the truth of that has now emerged in this memoir.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I actually, a couple of years ago, in around the end of 2022, I'd had a similar discussion with John Steenhuisen, in which I just, I'd kind of recently come back to South Africa, I'd finished university, and I went, what the hell went on, like, while I was away? What happened with this whole Musi thing and whatever? And he says, no, we got in this American guy who knew and who told the DA that, the the party has this historic issue of being seen as the racist party, and the best thing you can do to fix that image is everyone put their knives into the person who, built the party into the biggest opposition party in the country, and almost had its vote share doubled under her leadership. Put your knives into her and throw it to the wolves, because that'll show everyone what a bunch of lovely people you are, and definitely won't have the effect of making your voter base, who likes people like Helen Zille, go, what the hell is going on here?
Yeah, on the other,
Yeah.
No, James,
No,
you go. I'll
you
come in
go
later.
ahead, Frans. No, you go ahead.
Let me start here then. I haven't read this stuff from Self. Does it suggest that Greenberg thought this would work? Or does it suggest that there were people who knew it wouldn't but went along with it regardless?
They were under apparently the idea that they could bring the ANC under 50%, and the DA and Musi Maimane would be the next president. That was the illusion they were under. That was obviously in 2017, end of 2017, Zuma's no longer there. So Ramaphosa's now the president. So the Zuma push has gone because he's no longer president. But they carried on. And the Schweizer Renica was in the run-up to the election in 2019. So even though the facts had changed, the strategy continued. But I think it's so mad. I just wonder if it could have been. I just wonder if there was some other motive there, I must say.
Yeah, but what I would say, Gabriel, is what we said to the DA at the time was that this isn't going to work and it's going to do damage, and not because you're going to lose your 500,000 Afrikaner voters, but because black voters are already a bit suspicious of you, given how your reputation gets stigmatized in the media. And if your solution to that is to betray and revile and humiliate one of your most important leaders who's played such an important role in the party, what black voters are going to think is not, look, these guys are great, look, they're like us. They're going to think, hell, if these people won't even stand up for their own most important elderly woman, I mean, she'll live to be 100, but how are we going to trust them to look after us? And so you achieved the spectacular feat of alienating aspirant or potential black voters and Afrikaner voters and other English-speaking voters all at the same time. We were very suspicious at the time that that was put to them. And they said that's not true, it won't happen. But it was obviously going to be the effect of it. That's why I asked James if Self suggested there was something malevolent here, or whether it was just moronic levels of ignorance. Richard had his hand up.
Yeah, I just want to say that, any ordinary person, any ordinary voter, anybody sentient, except for those who are closeted up in an academic lounge at some university, knows that what Helen Zille said in the first place about Singapore is patently obvious and true. So, you don't get anywhere by peddling lies to people. Things that most ordinary people know are true, which is that you don't have to defend colonialism or colonial legacy to understand that there were benefits too, and that you can learn from those institutions. It's the whole, it's crazy. So it was, to me, it was bound to lose anyway, because you're lying to people.
Yeah. And I think what I seem to enjoy a lot now is the kind of irony of the fact that, come in 2017, 2018, the idea was that the way that the DA succeeds as a party is chuck Helen Zille to the wolves and, disassociate from her. And now we're in a situation in which the DA is going, please, Mama Helen, win us Johannesburg. Please, please, please. We can't do it without you. And so it's so interesting how the wheels of history turn. And,
Yeah, Gabriel, there was also a very offensive aspect to that period in the DA, because this wasn't done by an up-and-coming crew of young black leaders. This was done by whites who hired black leaders to front for them and then put them up to do these things on their behalf. And behind the scenes stood this crowd, chiefly white strategists, who fronted with a collection of black politicians and placed those people in very difficult positions. It was one thing, put it this way, it would be one thing if what was going on was that there was actually a black nationalist takeover of the DA, and this was being driven by people who believed in the ideas themselves and thought so. You might then argue with them and say they were wrong, but it would have at least a level of sort of legitimate decency to it. But it wasn't that. It was absolute fronting at its most terrible. And there's a particular story of the one chap they put up to drive the Schweizer Reneke stuff, who later felt that he'd been terribly betrayed when it came out. It was complete false news story, but he basically staked his reputation on saying, look at what this is going on in the school. And so they were willing to burn these young up-and-coming youngsters in their own party in order to front this absurd strategy. And blessedly, many of the people involved are no longer there.
Yeah, thank you, Franz and James, for that. And I think we'll stay on the topic of South Africa, moving away from bashing of the DA a little bit, but staying on this idea that you kind of slightly alluded to, that. And Franz, you're going to take us through some of the poll numbers on South Africans' voter beliefs. But just as a preface, and why I say you alluded to it, is because if anyone had paid attention to these numbers at any point in time, the idea would have been plainly obvious that what you said would happen with the Helen Zille when Helen was removed was going to happen.
Yeah, these numbers are amazing. They're dated, but that's why they are valuable. They come from 2022. What's happened is Gabriel and I are together in the Social Research Foundation. We reckon there are really big changes on the horizon. And we start to do the sort of deep dive polling to understand what's going to happen. And so I'm going to take you through some things. One of the questions we asked in July of 2022 was, which of the following reasons best describes why you vote for a political party? And you could pick a number of reasons. Why do you vote for the party you support? So amongst DA voters, about 60% said they vote for the DA because of what it stands for and because of how it governs, which is sort of what you might think you do. You support it because it's good. And 20% said they want to reduce the ANC majority, and then that would take us to 80, and then there were little bits and pieces of other options. But the responses from the ANC were extraordinary, because only 25% of ANC voters said, we vote for the party because we believe what it stands in and because it governs well. So 75% were voting for the ANC for another reason. In total, about 70% of ANC voters were voting for the ANC because they were at least of the same race as the voter. They didn't feel there was anyone else to vote for. Their parents voted that way. Or they said, frankly, we don't know why we're voting for the ANC anymore. And I think Gabriel and I both thought this is amazing, because what this means is the ANC base is completely shattered. If your own supporters can't say they support you because you govern well and they believe in what you're doing, but they split, and they was across those other reasons. 17% said because they're the same race as we are. 16% said we don't have any other options. 17% said because our parents did this, and 11% said frankly we don't know why we're voting for the ANC. And then we pressed further. So the question was put to respondents: which party do you most associate with the idea of having good policies? And amongst DA supporters, 70% of them said, yeah, the DA has good policies. We associate the DA with that. But so 70%. But amongst the ANC's voter base, only half thought that the idea of having good policies best described the ANC. The other half of ANC supporters thought that other parties, in fact, had better policies than the ANC had. When we took it down to the level of all voters, 29.5% said the phrase good policies best describes the DA. That was in first place. Behind them, with 28.6%, was the ANC. So a point had been reached where amongst all voters in the country, by a fraction, those were more likely to say the DA is the party we think of as having good policies, not the ANC. So we went further down this. We said, which party do you associate with the idea of good leadership? Amongst all voters, 30% said it's the DA, followed by the ANC at 26%. 70% of DA voters thought the DA showed good leadership. But only 51% of ANC voters thought that their own party showed good leadership. And it goes on and on and on. Which party provides accountability in government? You best associate with the idea of accountability. Amongst all voters, 34% said the DA, followed by the ANC in 26%. So we were still in a position there where on the polls, 50% of people were going to vote for the ANC at the time, and 20% were going to vote for the DA, or 22 or something. So that's how the vote would have turned out in 2022 had there been an election. But on the deeper issues of which parties are accountable, has good leadership and has good policies, in the public mind, the DA had already overtaken the ANC. Then we went to issues. These ones really stood out. I'm pulling this one up on my screen. Which party makes broken promises? With which party do you when we say broken promises, which party do you think of? Amongst all voters, 75% said the ANC. Amongst ANC voters, it was 55% who said, it's our party. That's the one we think of when you say that. In second place amongst ANC voters was the DA at 15%, makes broken promises, and the EFF in third place at 12%. And we started to think we started to think the country's already changed. These ANC strategists have already lost, because on the core issues, they're now behind the DA. We then asked the question, we put the phrase, if we say a party only cares about themselves, not about anyone and the people, which party are we describing? Which one did you think of? Amongst all voters, 56% said the ANC is the party you're referring to, followed by the DA in second place at 16% and the EFF in third at 10%. Inside the ANC's own voter base, 40% said, yeah, that's our party. That's the one you're talking about when you say only cares about themselves. Then just a little tangent away from the ANC and the DA, we're going to get back to them. We said, which party spreads hatred in society? 51% of voters said that was the EFF, with the ANC in second place at 20%, and the DA in third at 7%. We then said, which party is if we say the violent party, which one is that? Who do you associate with that? And 70% of voters said that's the EFF, followed by the ANC at 14 and the DA at 1. So we thought the polls are very accurate, because the DA chaps aren't sort of violent types. Then we went to anti-poor, and here something really stood out again. So we said the anti-poor party, the one that doesn't care about the poor, makes them poorer. Which party do you associate that with when you heard the phrase? And amongst all voters, 40% said, yeah, you're describing the ANC. The DA was in second place at 20%. And it's very important, because the ANC was using that kind of idea. The DA is anti-poor, the DA is anti-poor. But what was being heard, this data suggested in people's minds, is that their own voters were actually thinking maybe it's them. And then when I go to the ANC column in the chart, so which party do you associate with anti-poor? Amongst ANC voters, 60% said, yeah, that's our party. That's the anti-poor party. And our read into that was these were people who really cared about the ANC. The ANC's relationship with its voters, the brand-client relationship is a very deep and important one. And these were people who were so very disappointed at how the ANC was governing, that they were driven to point this out in great numbers. And the thought we had is, this data preempts what's going to happen in future elections. It's just the time for the voting. It's just time. It might just be a question of time, we thought, before the voting pattern on the day catches up with these kinds of numbers. And we're actually non-partisan, and we're very happy to talk to the ANC about some of this and show it. And some people did see it and were very worried by it, and thought it was important. But I later learned that nothing had been done with it at all. There's so much the sort of, I suppose, the sort of tragedy for people who are interested in the ANC's success, that even if you sort of offer it the opportunity to do something, like the deal in America we've been talking about. It will sit and not respond, and it never responded to this material adequately, and to this very day it doesn't do so. Yeah, Gabriel.
Yeah, and so France, I know actually what the document that you're looking at and the numbers that you're looking at, you're reading from, and I think that you've covered the first part of the story that are in those numbers very well. That the ANC has a serious brand we're going into last year's election has a serious brand problem, that the voters associated only the majority of voters only associated it with negative phrases, that it only cares about themselves, makes broken promises, and anti-poor, and that its own voters are starting to move and associate positive qualities with the DA. But then we have a whole another set of numbers which demonstrates the other fact, which is that the voters in fact know about policy, and they know that, and they have a strong policy preference. And so maybe France, you take us through the second kind of issue we saw play out.
Yeah, let me get that. That sheet's not up here at the moment. Let me go somewhere else first, which is you made the point that the data showed that there were these kind of, in terms of the brand of the DA, it was breaking through and had in fact overtaken that of the ANC amongst all voters, and the voting pattern was waiting to catch up. So why was the ANC still then polling at 50%? And here were some of the reasons. These ones have just popped up. Well, one of the questions that we asked is, try to find why are people voting for the ANC if this has happened. So one of the questions is, if the ANC dropped below 50% in a future election, would you continue to support it? And only 2/3 of its voters said yes. And we thought in that there's something very important, that you're turning out to vote for the ANC because you might as well vote for the party that's going to win an election, which is a perfectly sensible thing to do. I mean, you might as well vote for the winning side. And we thought then that, look, if the ANC is going to go under 50, which we knew it could, that's going to trigger an even sharper dissent, because the reason to vote for you're frustrated with the ANC, you don't think it's governed well, you don't like its policies, it's not accountable, it's anti-poor, but at least it's winning. So we'll be there, it gives us a chance. But if the ANC goes under 50, we thought a big chunk of the ANC vote is going to fall out of the bottom of the party. The second question that gave us a similar kind of feeling was the point was, the statement was put to respondents: the country will devolve into anarchy and violence if the ANC is ever voted out of power. It will fall apart in sort of violent mayhem. And 60% of ANC voters agreed with that. And we thought this is very dangerous for the ANC, because if the ANC is voted out of power, we don't think the country will devolve into more mayhem than it is ordinarily in. And ANC voters will see the ANC go under 50, see that things remain pretty much the way they were when the ANC was in power. And this sort of negative motivation to vote for the ANC, we might as well, because otherwise there'll be violence and anarchy in the streets. And remember, in a lot of poor communities, South Africa sees a lot of political protest action and violence, but for the poor, that's often very real, because it happens on the streets. Kids get involved in protests, they get shot by the police. Shops get looted, foreign immigrants who run many of the shops in poor communities get attacked and worse. And so those communities really suffer from violence, whereas elite South African society, to some extent, can retreat to its enclaves during sort of moments of unrest. And we thought that if the ANC voters see that the ANC loses power and there's not more violence and anarchy than usual, this as a motivating factor to stay in the ANC is also going to fall away. And then the third one that we asked, and this is really a statement how disgraceful South Africa's mainstream media has been, we said the DA will bring back apartheid if it ever gets to power, and 70% of ANC voters said they believe that will happen, because they'd been taught that by the media. The media had articulated that view. But then the DA did, in some respects, get to power. It's in the cabinet, as many cabinet seats, governs with the ANC. And initially, if you were to be critical of the DA and government, you say it was so very meek and obliging to the ANC, almost trying to not offend its new partner in government. And that sentiment fell away as well. And I had a little session a while back for some people who weren't of the DA. And I said to them, in some respects, you guys did a really weird thing in getting into the GNU. Because firstly, you've fallen under 50, so that reason to vote for you, if there's no other reason, that's gone. You've shown the country that when you're gone, it doesn't devolve into anarchy and violence. So that reason to vote for you is gone. And you've demonstrated, which was obviously always the case, and you all knew it, that the DA has no intention of reintroducing anything approaching apartheid. And now you've taken that away. And this is what the GNU's done, and therefore it's placed the DA strategically in a much stronger position relative to yourselves because of this GNU. But you can't back out now. You can't now undo the GNU and say, well, can't we go back to where we were just a few months ago? Because people have seen it. The spell has been broken. And your only way back, if you are the ANC and you wish to get back to power, and I think the ANC can, is actually to improve the material circumstances of people in a similar way to which that party did so in the first 13 or 14 years after 1994.
Franz, can I just talk to you? Can I just
And
ask you
another
about...
reason, just on that, another reason was that people had confidence in Mr. Ramaphosa as a leader. They don't have that confidence in any of his potential successors. And so we added this to the list, saying, look, the next time you go to a national election, you're going to do so without him. So you're going to go to an election in a position where people don't think the DA are racist bringing back apartheid. They're not scared of anarchy and violence. They've got no reason to vote for you as the winning party, because you're not the winning party, and you don't have Cyril Ramaphosa. Really, you guys are in serious trouble, and your only way out is a really aggressive move towards raising the investment rate by, this was before the American business and Trump's election. But if we were doing that today, we'd say by, for example, hastening yourselves to the White House Historical Association dinner that you should have attended, but didn't, and saying, yeah, we want to do a massive investment pact with you way beyond tariffs, reindustrialize South Africa. And that's the sort of route that might get you back to power in 2029. Gabriel.
Yeah, Franz, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the kind of psychological effects of the GNU. And James, I'll come to you right after that. Maybe you can add to this question. But I've got this sense, as you point out, we sit in the SRF together, so I get to look at these numbers as well as you do. And I had this sense that everything you pointed out about what happens now that the ANC has introduced the GNU into the kind of South African psyche, that it's gotten rid of the kind of negative aspects that kept people inside of the ANC tent, and then it has also provided a lot of legitimacy towards the DA by, if there were actually horrific, horrible racists who wanted to bring back apartheid, then the ANC would never be willing to work with them. But in fact, they're not that. And so the ANC is perfectly happy to work with them. But a point that you didn't touch on, which I think is really interesting and worth thinking about, is I think that, as you point out, that the DA's been put in a fantastic strategic position because of the GNU, but also they've been put in a fantastic strategic position because it's very easy for them to be, it is actually very good for them, I think, in the eyes of a lot of the South African public, to be seen as a useful contributor. So they came in, they weren't, aggressive, loud, and demanding of the ANC. Said no. Now that we're in government, you have to listen to us. They said no. We're kind of happy to help you, and this is actually quite a good look for them, especially in the short term, because essentially they hand off the responsibility for poor performance back to the ANC. They say, you guys want to claim leadership of the GNU? That's totally fine, because that you're not making any of the necessary improvements to the country, and so it's not like we're losing out on claiming these massive victories. What we're doing is we're kind of washing our hands of being responsible for the implementation of your policies, but we're willing to be a helpful and useful partner. And people see that interaction and go, well, yeah, I guess these DA guys are really not that bad. They even willing to go so far as to implement some things that they don't really like, because they don't want to kick up a fuss and throw tantrums and whatever. And I think that that the kind of psychological effect that has, if day in day out you see, will be enough to kind of break any of the last remaining arguments as to why you should hold inside of the ANC.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But now it's too late for the ANC, because the public are so invested in this GNU deal. They really like it. They liked it before it was even real. They liked it even before the election. The idea of it. It's a bit dated, but public opinion still thinks the GNU is doing pretty well. I suppose that's off the relative baseline of what the alternative was. And so the ANC has no way out now. Because if it were to, let's say, hear this conversation and think, oh, what have we done? Let's immediately terminate this. You're simply compounding the error, because the public likes the deal now. And so you're making one mistake after the other. It's a thing James and I sometimes talk about, that and the ANC used to be really good at taking strategic decisions. It was really good at that. And of the last few years, it's just shocking. Every decision is a mistake. It's a massive mistake with huge negative repercussions for the party. One step after the other, culminating in this thing a few weeks ago when Mr. Ramaphosa told his ANC colleagues that the country would be better off if it was governed by the DA. That's to say to your supporters who already suspect this might be true, that you yourself have come to this view. So yeah, the inability, just the mistakes that get made time and again. And as we said often the show's only been going for a month or so, but as we say often and will say on this show often, the ANC should never have gone to 40% last year. It could comfortably have been at 55 if it just made some basically sensible decisions. And it could comfortably, I think, still be at 55 in the future if it just takes some basically sensible decisions. Gabriel.
James, you wanted to contribute something?
No, it's just obviously the ANC very effectively dug this great moat between sort of majority and minority in South Africa. And so even when the ANC is very unpopular and there's a splinter, that splinter goes to firstly the EFF or now the MK party. Is there a point at which that moat no longer is effective and a big split can go the way of a sort of DA party or DA-like party?
I think so. I think this is why the race in Johannesburg is so important, and why it's so important that Helen of Singapore is the one who's leading that race. Because what Greenberg and co never properly understood, if they understood anything at all, was that given the economic trajectory the country was on, the hierarchy of needs of voters was sure to shift. And as that hierarchy of needs shifts to where it's just James's point he's made to me that, when the ANC still had high rates of growth and high rates of job creation, the public was pretty happy. It's only when, even if there was corruption, the corruption and so on only really become this massive political liability for them once living standards have started to slip, and people are now looking for reasons why. And that was inevitably going to happen, the slippage of living standards. We predicted that in every way one can. And when that happens, people start getting serious. And what someone says on Twitter matters relatively less than it did before. And having water every day, if you live in Johannesburg, matters relatively more. And then you get this hard figure like Helen Zille, or certainly the hard exterior, which so many analysts have so long said is this great political liability that's holding back the DA's growth. I mean, virtually the Greenberg thesis. And in Johannesburg and beyond that, more broadly, that's starting to change. And I think the view is becoming that perhaps the fact that she is hard and difficult and stubborn and determined and fights is exactly the character trait that's needed to turn the city around. And should she succeed in that and demonstrate some success, the effect could very easily be to break a chunk of the aspirant middle-class vote off the urban fringes for the DA into the election in 2029, which would then make it an election. We call it the 30% election, because the DA will be attacking the 30% number from below. It's got 22 in the last election, polling around 25, 26. And the ANC will be attacking the 30% number from above. It got 40% in the last election, but it's polled as into the low 30s this year, and back at 40, and then back into the low 30s. So I think, yeah, if she succeeds in Johannesburg, brings about some successes, I'd say it's perfectly plausible to think that we're then going to a 30% election in 2029. And it will be very difficult to tell someone who asks which of the two parties is going to be above the other.
And I'd just like to say on that point of the kind of, if the kind of dominoes falling, that if Helen manages to win, demonstrate some positive forward momentum, that we get this assault and then the shift in the country. I think it is, if it does play out as we think that it might, it would be the most incredible story of a bottom-up societal change, by which, the kind of country, the society shifts before the politics, and it takes, almost a decade probably of hard work, but of kind of people filtering into the right places for the changes to eventually manifest themselves in the political scene. But I think that the change has already happened in society, that we've moved away from, and we've had a couple of podcast guests on Talking Sense who've made this same point. The society has already moved on from the ANC's mode of governance, and we're in this transition period, moving to a new South African governance system.
Henry Kissinger told Helen Zille that South Africa might not succeed because it's a multicultural society, and these are very difficult kinds of societies to run successfully. And I think she's always fought against that idea in every way you can think of it. And it would be, when you said what a turnaround this would be, Gabriel, I just thought of that and how that comment would age. And just beyond that, I'm not suggesting Kissinger was wrong necessarily, that multicultural societies are hard to run, but rather that South Africa isn't a multicultural society. Because on the core values, so culture is the collection of values that a group of people wish to live according to. On the core values, there's actually very little difference between the views of ANC voters and the views of DA voters. And I know we thought we might get today into talking about that a bit and the detail and the numbers. We've been talking a lot about numbers. I wonder if we shouldn't perhaps hold that over to next week, and the next week go into the data that shows that on values questions and on policy questions, there's very little difference in the views of DA and ANC voters at all, before you even get to this sort of nonsense in the media that the two sides hold completely opposite views. They actually hold almost identical views and on how the country should be governed.
Yes, I think to everyone who's listening right now, tune in again next week to get the second half of this story, because France is right that we have been shotgunning too many numbers at our audience, and I think it's time that we turn our attention away from South Africa. And unfortunately, we cannot. We would normally go to Simon, who is but as we mentioned, he's currently being held in a dungeon in the Tower of London, being tortured by the Green Party. This is the word I'm getting in. And so, Richard, it's gonna go. We're gonna go back to you because James Comey has been indicted in the United States. And it looks like we might be getting a little bit of tit-for-tat lawfare. So can you take us through this and maybe provide some context to who James Comey is? Why does this matter? All of that good stuff. Thanks, Richard.
Sure, yeah. So James Comey is the former director of the FBI, and he was a former Republican. He had been in the George W. Bush administration in the Department of Justice, and then Obama appointed him to lead the FBI. And he was there. They have long term. I think it's like a 10-year term. So he bled over into the first Trump administration, and then was fired by Trump. And he's been indicted by a grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia and I think the charge is making false statements to Congress and obstructing a congressional investigation. And this all goes back to a hearing in which he was asked by Senator Ted Cruz from Texas about whether or not he knew of a leak that was made by one of his underlings, a man called Andrew McCabe, and it all had to do with an investigation into the Clinton administration. And so these charges, so look, why do they bring these charges? Well, allegedly, he had made false statements previously, but the statute of limitations had run out on those. This was done in 2020. It was actually during COVID. It was a remote hearing, rather like we're doing now. And the statute of limitations ran out, like they had a few more days. So they rushed this case forward. Andrew McCarthy, who's a very good legal analyst who writes for National Review, and many other legal analysts have said this is a very weak case. And it's revealing that the Trump-appointed district attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia didn't want to bring this case. He said, this is a nonsense case. We're going to lose. I don't want to bring it. So Trump fired him and appointed one of his friend lawyers, who's an insurance lawyer, who's never prosecuted a case. She doesn't even do this kind of thing. And she brought this case and got the grand jury to indict him. Grand juries work. The prosecutor brings evidence. They hear no exculpatory evidence. They don't hear anything from the other side. People joke here that you can get a grand jury to convict a ham sandwich. It's a very easy thing to do. But it's likely that this case will be they'll lose. But it's very revealing. And let me be on record here. This is a very bad move of the Trump administration. This is not how our system is supposed to work. But I feel nothing for Comey. He is a sanctimonious blowhard who is guilty of exactly the same things. And a lot of people are pointing out that, what goes around comes around. Comey inserted himself into politics for ages. He was the one who's brought this investigation into Hillary Clinton and into her sort of jerry-rigged home email server that endangered national security by just running her own email. This is when she was Secretary of State under Obama. You don't do this kind of thing. So he came out and he's spoke about that, saying like this is against the rules, but we're not going to prosecute her. Now he's the investigator. He was then head of the FBI. He doesn't get to decide whether or not to prosecute a case. He's the policeman. He just brings the evidence. But he said no reasonable prosecutor would bring it, so we, the FBI, we're just going to drop it. And then he reinvestigated Hillary Clinton just before the election, and many people think that this is what actually pushed Trump over the line. This is what got Trump elected, because they reopened this investigation because Huma Abedin, who was one of Hillary Clinton's assistants, her husband, this guy called Anthony Weiner, of sexting fame. He was a congressman married to Huma Abedin, who had, in his off hours, sends his dick pics to children, well, teenagers, and yeah, this is all very sordid, and they've ended up divorced. But so Comey reopened the case. Just giving the background that he has, people credit him for handing that election, the first election, to Trump, and for Hillary Clinton's loss. And now, so he's inserted himself into politics. It was his investigations and his own use of lawfare that really led to the whole Russiagate affair. He was the one who was, it's under his leadership that the FBI lied to a judge to be able to tap the phones of Trump campaign staff. This is all coming from within the FBI that was under his leadership, and so no one should feel any sympathy for Comey, even though we can disagree vehemently with this kind of ongoing lawfare. But he's the one who started it. I don't want to hear a peep from all of those who, during the 4 years of the Obama administration, cheered along when the Biden administration and when various Democratic district attorneys, like those in New York, Letitia James among them, brought cases against President Trump that were just nonsense cases. This was just designed to harm his electioneering and to tie Biden's political opponents up in the law courts. There was a case against him for a perfectly ordinary loan that he took out from Deutsche Bank. There was this case against Stormy Daniels and supposedly questionable payments there. There was actually a solid case against Trump for his mishandling of classified material that was stored at Mar-a-Lago. But at the same time, President Clinton had found to have taken classified material and stored them in his garage, famously next to his Corvette. So you do get the sense that there's a two-tier system of justice. And this is very worrying. And, Democrats, like during the whole Trump affair, when Trump was being sued and were taken to court for all these, indicted for all these in these cases, people would always say no one is above the law, and that's true, but no one's beneath the law either. And Trump, it seemed to them, was beneath the law, and they brought these cases this was lawfare, and now it's the shoe is on the other foot. And the writer Noam Blum came out a while ago saying talking about these kinds of cases, saying that this is a slippery slope, beware. And then somebody dredged up this tweet and said, well, yes, but this is worse. And the response is, yes, that is the nature of the slippery slope. I don't want to hear a peep from these people that started us down this road, and now things are getting worse, and it's getting ugly, and it's bad for our republic, and I don't like it, and I don't know how to get back. But they can shut up for a second. Let the conservatives and libertarians that oppose this kind of lawfare take the lead. And if you were a Democrat out there cheering on the lawfare before, we are eating at the table. You set the table that we're now dining at. We are, how can I make another metaphor? We're sleeping in the bed that you made. Enjoy it. Thank you very much. Congratulations. How do we get out of this now? I don't know. It's very distressing.
Yeah, I think I think a theme that will seems to be emerging in a lot of our discussions around America is it seems as though we're watching the pendulum swing happening, that a lot of the issues that will be, a focus, and the places in which, Richard, you'll take issue with the Trump administration, seems as though it always comes from a reaction to things that had happened in previous Democratic administrations. So, the lawfare, the incessant lawfare against Trump. I can't remember the exact day, but the academic Victor Davis Hanson puts it very well, that on one day in 2023, three cases in three different jurisdictions are lodged against Trump in a coordinated effort to take down his election campaign. That the response to this by the Trump administration is to go after and try and get some revenge does seem like like a logical next step, because the we aren't, as we've talked about in a couple of episodes now, the Trump administration is not, say, as committed as we would like them to be to the kind of classic liberal ideas. And in fact, they kind of aren't opposed to the overt use of state power to secure their agenda. And now that this can of worms has been opened up, well, they feel as if, maybe, why don't we use it?
Yeah, yeah. It's none of it is good, and and we're all getting a bit sick of this kind of thing. We hear repeatedly how Trump is a fascist, and the Secretary of War, not Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, gathered all the generals together recently to talk to them about fitness and getting wokery out of the military. And this was apparently a sign of the rise of fascism now. We're all apparently going to be herded into concentration camps. Give me a break. I don't know, where were these people when Barack Obama used a drone to kill Anwar al-Awlaki, who was an American citizen. He was an Islamist, he was a bad guy, he was in Yemen, but he was an American citizen. And without any kind of due process, Barack Obama used a drone to kill him, and then he killed his teenage son. And these were not nice people, but they were American citizens who deserved due process. They had certain rights. These people were silent. But we're supposed to believe that because Pete Hegseth gets his generals together to talk to them about that we need a military that's fit, get the fatties out and make sure you can run 5 miles, that's suddenly fascism. I'm sorry, I'm sick of this. Again and again and again, you hear that the left wanting to tear down our institutions. It's coming from the left that they want to stack the Supreme Court. It's coming from the left that they want to get rid of the filibuster in the Senate and make it easier to pass the legislation. And they did that when it comes to under Obama, when they changed the threshold for which they can approve judges, because the Republicans were blocking judges. Well, that came back to bite them. Now we have a very conservative Supreme Court, thanks to that kind of thing. So these things tend to come back and bite them, but we are incapable of learning lessons. Everybody thinks that they're going to be in power forever. They never think a few years down the line when another party will be in power and they'll use these tools against you. And like I said, we're down this slippery slope, and I'm not sure how we get back up to the top.
For any frustrated listeners who are thinking that we're giving Donald Trump a soft time, I challenge you to give me one example of a use of executive authority by Donald Trump that hasn't been matched by any Democratic president in the past. And I defy you to find me the one example. So
Yeah.
I think that is a great place to leave it today, gentlemen. So thank you so much to all of you for your contributions, and thank you to all of the ladies and gentlemen listening at home. And remember to tune in again next week for another episode of South Africa's Best News Podcast. I'm Gabriel Makin, and this has been Making Sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel.